Hello again, YouTube. Thank you for joining me. This is one of those reviews that I've tried to start multiple times, and it's just not coming out right. And I know why this is. Here is your long, detailed spoiler warning. Skipping to what should be part of my final judgment, the biggest disappointment I have with this anime is that they don't go into the story's most important plot twist, the one that really develops one of our main characters. If you haven't read the manga or just don't know what happens, then this show is probably a lot more enjoyable. However, knowing what they leave out tainted it a little bit for me. So as far as spoilers go, I plan to be pretty vague about the story aspect of this. I do want to discuss each of the characters and how, or if, they develop throughout the series, but if it isn't mentioned in the anime, I won't be covering it here, even if it is really central to their character. I will be reviewing the manga, so I can really discuss this cast of characters, but as far as this review goes, you won't be getting any major spoilers from me. Okay, so Ghost Hunt starts out showing our protagonist, Mai Taniyama, spending time with her friends after school telling ghost stories, specifically stories about the old schoolhouse. This isn't unusual for them, but today they're interrupted by a mysterious boy who introduces himself as Kazuya Shibuya, who Mai quickly nicknames Naru for being a bit of a narcissist. He tells them that he's the head of a psychic research company, despite not being much older than they are, and that their principal has hired him to investigate the very schoolhouse that they were just telling stories about. Later, Mai goes to see the building herself, and manages to injure Naru's assistant. She is promptly guilted into helping Naru in Lin's place, and so our story starts. But it turns out that the principal was not totally confident in Naru's abilities, because he also calls in a famous medium, a monk, who they call Monk, a shrine maiden with questionable training, and a Catholic priest with a cartoonish Australian accent and the most generic English name possible. Seriously, I don't know if the name John Brown was a joke, laziness, or the original author just not knowing any better. I'd have to guess that to the Japanese, his name just sounds foreign. Anyway, after this first case, they all just happen to show up for the next one too, and without ever really saying it, they all kind of just become one big team. In the second half of the show, they also have a case at a different school where they gain another assistant, just because he's almost aggressively helpful, and thus we have our ghost hunting team. There isn't really one cohesive storyline, unless you count watching the characters grow over the course of the series, which honestly felt like a background aspect of this show, but I'll get to that. Instead, this 25-episode anime covers Mai's account of 8 of their most interesting cases. They usually spend 3 or 4 episodes to complete a case, with the exception of episode 11, which felt a little like filler, but even if you came to that same conclusion, I still suggest watching it. Episode 11 is the first episode where they really start to address Masako's character, and it's just easily the most entertaining, featuring our lovable team of ghost hunters abusing their authority in the name of romantic justice. Anyway, animation-wise, I wish I was more well-versed in this field so I could discuss it a bit more at length, but even without any expertise here, I can say that the animation caught my attention right away. Not so much the character designs, though no real complaints there. The designs suit the characters, and they're at least unique enough for us to tell them all apart, which isn't always the case when anime characters are made to look realistic. What did catch my eye, right from the earliest episodes, was the abundance of flashy scene transitions and things like split screens and other effects. Which isn't to say these things are completely absent from other anime I've seen, but they felt particularly noticeable here. Sound-wise, okay, I did watch this one through in the dub, and I am not a person who has any real preference in the dubs versus subs debate, but I can only really listen to one set of actors. The characters' voices get ingrained in my mind, and if I try to switch over, I spend more time trying to deal with the character voices just not sounding right than I spend actually paying attention to the episode. I can see value in both sides of the debate, but it's very simple for me. I just pick one and stick with it. Had I known a little more about this show before I started it, though, I probably would have watched it subbed. Ghost Hunt is one of those shows where the characters don't all come from the same country, so their cultures are openly addressed, and culture is not something that translates perfectly. That said, Funimation is pretty good at what they do, and there were only a few places where the translation was noticeably shaky. The only other complaint I have was really just something I had to get used to, which would be the contrast between Naru and Mai. Mai's voice is just naturally really loud, and Naru speaks at almost a whisper, and they share a lot of screen time. I can't tell if they purposely toned it down a bit or if I just got used to it as the episodes went on, but in the beginning it felt like I was constantly adjusting the volume. As for the story, I've already mentioned that it's really more like 8 mini-stories, but there is at least the ghost hunting aspect of it running through the whole thing. I am no ghost hunting expert myself, but the episodes were filled with actual historical research and explanations, and I kind of felt like I should be taking notes, but in a good way. It was all very interesting, and it added some credibility to their cases. And now that all the technical stuff has been addressed, let's get to what I really wanted to discuss: the characters. Be warned, if there are any spoilers in this review, they'll be found here. Let's start with Mai. Our narrator was perfectly likable, if a little contradictory. She is generally depicted as being very good-hearted and down-to-earth. When she is outspoken, which is pretty often, it's because it's very easy for her to get caught up in their cases. She's passionate about everything, but she doesn't hold grudges, with the exception of that one wacky fillerish episode. The contradictions really only stand out in 2 situations. One is her crush on Naru. Sometimes she'll openly acknowledge it, only to later seem shocked by the very notion that she could have a crush on her boss. And she has an almost identical problem with one other important aspect of her character. Very early on, starting from their very first case, Mai starts having dreams that give her special insights into whatever haunting the gang is investigating. Coincidentally, in these dreams, she's usually guided along by a much nicer version of her boss, which is where her crush stems from. And there is literally nothing else I can explain about this topic because this is as far as the anime covers. Just wait for the manga review. I've never been so excited to spoil everything. Anyway, Mai treats this very much like her crush. Even after her abilities are openly acknowledged by everyone else, there are still moments when she doesn't seem to believe it herself. It's like times when the audience knows exactly what's going on, but the characters haven't quite put everything together yet. Except it gets to the point where Mai has no excuse not to be just as on top of things as we are. All in all, I wouldn't be surprised to learn if a lot of people found Mai to be unbearably annoying, but I personally really liked her character. Let's move on to the character who develops the least over the course of the series: Monk. Monk really gets his shining moment in their final case when Naru is out of action and he takes over as leader. It's also around this time in the series that we finally learn something about his backstory. Hosho Takigawa, or Monk, has been trained as a Buddhist exorcist from a very young age. We learn that his parents owned a temple, but as I'm sure you can see just from his appearance, he is hardly a traditional monk. I attribute his modernness to 2 factors. One, he's young. What person in their 20s wouldn't rather hunt ghosts instead of manage a temple? And 2, his upbringing. We never meet his parents or anything, but growing up in a family that owned a temple, I'd venture a guess he didn't have much choice in the matter of his training. Which isn't to say he ever seems openly resentful or unhappy about it. He is still clearly invested in his work. Leaving home to join a rock band definitely has a rebellious feel to it, though. And those two pieces of information, that he's in a band and that his parents owned a shrine, are really the only things we learn about Monk, and both scenes are brief and never mentioned again. And I think they only added in the band thing to try and make him look even cooler, but he really didn't need it. Of all the characters, Monk was consistently the most effective in warding off any evil spirits they came across, and overall he was just a very likable character. The only time he was ever in any conflict with the other characters was when that character, yeah, usually Mai, had done something stupid that put someone else in danger. Moving on to a character who was never in conflict with anyone, John was probably my favorite character to analyze. I mentioned that I'm not one to watch one show both subbed and dubbed, but I broke this rule for a few of John's scenes. I'll remind you that John was the Australian Catholic priest, and whenever cultural differences came up, it was usually because of him. He was always very humble and polite. We dodged the obnoxious foreigner stereotype there, but he is where you'll see the most dub edits. For example, in the very first episode where he introduces himself to the group as an exorcist, Monk and Ayako immediately start laughing. In the subbed version, this is because John speaks using a very eccentric dialect of Japanese. The best comparison I can give you would be if a person who'd spent their entire life in Japan showed up in America one day sounding like they learned to speak English in the deep south. So in the original, Monk and Ayako are laughing at his accent. Of course, this joke isn't really relevant in the dubbed version, where all the characters are speaking John's first language, so they try to pass it off that they're laughing because he looks too young to be a fully qualified exorcist. But it does come across feeling a little forced. I am glad, though, that they didn't try to link the joke to a language they weren't actually speaking. In their second-to-last case, there's one of those scenes that didn't translate quite so well for exactly this reason. The team is working with a man who is supposedly a very famous psychic from England. Spoiler alert, he's not, and he outs himself by speaking in fluent Japanese, which for obvious reasons didn't make quite as much sense in the dubbed version. Anyway, back to John. He's just very, very nice. He's always super polite and goes out of his way not to offend anyone. I don't think he ever uses the nickname Naru to Naru's face, even though he doesn't seem to mind it, and everyone else does. And I see why this could make him seem a little bland, but I really don't have many complaints about John, and none really about his specific character. He was just as useful as Monk when it came to actually hunting ghosts, and he worked really well with everyone. It's not quite as prominent after the first case, but there is a certain level of competition amongst our ghost hunters, and John is usually the one, quite literally in one scene, standing in the middle of it all going, "Can't we all just get along?" Now, on the other hand, Ayako and Masako were the two in the running for least likable character. I want to make it clear that by the end I didn't dislike either of them. They both have their place in the group, they just don't shine like the others do. Ayako Matsuzaki is our shrine maiden, and there's something a little suspicious about her from the very beginning. I mean, Monk calls her out on being a little old to be calling herself a maiden, but it's more than that. In terms of effectiveness, Ayako is easily the least useful of the bunch, which is saying something considering Masako spends the majority of their first two cases in the hospital. Ayako is always around, but she never seems to accomplish much of anything. None of her spells or exorcisms do much good, not that you'd know that given her snobby personality. She's accepted as part of the group pretty easily, but I feel like that's really just because she's always just there. Despite the writer's efforts to make the last case stand out, the second to last is the darkest and most intense. It was the first one where I felt like the characters were really in danger, and it gets to the point where Naru forbids them from investigating alone. And when he takes stock of who is able to protect themselves, it even surprised me when Masako, who had shown no defensive abilities or training up to this point, said she'd be fine, but Ayako admitted she wouldn't. Monk starts pointing out that it's a little odd for a shrine maiden to be working alone, so she's another one who gets a backstory hastily thrown in the second to last episode, when 24 episodes in she finally does something useful, and explains that, due to the nature of her abilities, she will essentially be powerless for the next 6 months. But we do learn that her parents were very well off, explaining her personality at least. Overall, I didn't really dislike any of the characters, but Ayako's the one who got on my nerves the most. Followed by Masako, but I feel that that's entirely thanks to the way she was portrayed. Masako is actually a very interesting character. She's a famous televised spirit medium, and she also comes across as being a little uppity, but she's very reserved about it. It doesn't help either that she's particularly cold towards Mai, because guess who also has a crush on Naru? I think the biggest reason I originally disliked Masako, though, is that the show is almost half over by the time she's really present in an episode, and she spends a large portion of that episode possessed by a ghost. As Masako starts to become more important, it really does Mai's character some good for always being fair to her even when Masako is being less than kind. But it's also worth noting that Masako is a child celebrity, and all her coldness is probably because she doesn't have a lot of experience with having friends or connecting to others. Again, I don't think she's a bad character, and like all characters connected to Naru, she's got more depth than I can talk about here. Before moving on to our final member, there are 2 more characters who are important members of the team, but they never really escape their minor character status. First is Lin, Naru's assistant, who does return to the team after his injuries heal. Lin is a very skilled and powerful onmyoji, but he does most of his work from the background, and he has actually been working with Naru since his boss was a child, so of course he's another character that I can't discuss in full until the manga review. Yasuhara is that second, or I guess third, assistant that they pick up when they investigate a case at his high school. I think he's the character I'd most like to see developed more. As I mentioned earlier, he's mostly just overly helpful. There was something about him that kind of makes me want to dislike him. He does say this about himself. I've had a lot of people say that I'm a politician in training. They'll say, I can never tell if you're really friendly or just really full of it. Which is about the conclusion I'd come to about him. But there's never anything that proves he's a con man, so for now we just have to assume that he's just a really nice guy who likes a good practical joke. So finally, we've made it to Naru. Where to begin with him? He's almost not even worth talking about until I can discuss everything, but he's also too important to ignore. So, as much backstory as we're given, his father is a wealthy professor who spent his life studying the paranormal, so that at least explains how a 17-year-old is able to run a company. His own abilities enact such a physical toll on his body that he rarely uses them, so he does his ghost hunting with fancy cameras and other expensive equipment. Naru is supremely confident, and he falls into the role of leader very easily. The others quickly learn that if they want things to run smoothly, they'll just have to take orders. So I think what frustrates me the most about Ghost Hunt is how much hinting they do at that big thing they never reveal. With 25 episodes to work with, they were not nearly as pressed for time as they could have been. The anime ends right before the final storyline. I know some people go a little crazy if the anime isn't as close to the manga as possible, but I wouldn't have minded if they'd cut out one of the earlier storylines to make room for the important one. There's just too much build-up to not get the big reveal. For example, Naru may be arrogant, but that's not necessarily narcissism, and it would seem like Mai's just exaggerating if it wasn't for his reaction, because Naru's response isn't, "What does that mean?" or "Why did you call me that?" but "Where did you hear that name?" insinuating that someone had used it before. Of course, Mai comes to the conclusion that it's just an obvious nickname, but there were only a few scenes that I would really describe as narcissistic, and I suspect that they were put on for the benefit of maintaining his reputation. Later on, Lin starts laughing in the middle of an argument with Mai, saying he'd been reminded of someone who'd said the same thing, and in case I have not already made it painfully clear, that someone is the big twist that the anime doesn't reveal. So, to wrap up my longest review to date, there are a few places Ghost Hunt falls short. The incomplete story is the biggest thing. But I really wish they'd made the characters more of a priority. They set up an interesting and likable cast of ghost hunters, but when it comes down to it, we are actually told very little about each of them. Monk and Ayako's paths are briefly mentioned at least, but I would have loved to see them go into Masako's life growing up in the spotlight, or John's motivations for becoming an exorcist. In fact, their personal beliefs are never really brought up, even though they're certainly relevant. I never thought I'd be the one pushing for a show to be more slice-of-life-like, but this show probably could have benefited from a few more scenes of the characters just spending time getting to know each other a little better. That said, I did really enjoy this show. I liked the interactions between the characters that we did get. I love the supernatural ghost hunting aspect of it, and most of all, I love seeing a bunch of adults, young adults, but still, discussing supernatural hauntings and possessions like there's nothing strange about it. Just another day's work. So no, the anime doesn't tell the whole story, but I'd suggest checking it out anyway. I appreciate anything that makes me laugh one minute and is genuinely scary the next. It's definitely worth your time. Especially because the manga may be a little hard to get your hands on, but that's a story for another day. For now, thank you for watching.